So with regard to the system, briefly, can you briefly explain what the system is and how it works?
Well, we have jury instructions in California that help jurors determine if a witness is telling the truth and could be considered reliable. And it's like 13 questions that we allow jurors to think about as they're listening to witnesses. Those break down into 4 categories, and here they are. Number 1, was the witness really there? Can you demonstrate that he was there? Sometimes people will say they saw something, but actually we determined they weren't even in the state. So it's all a lie. 2, have they been consistent? Or can they be corroborated in some way? Is there something? Now remember, corroboration and verification is always touch point. So if you have a witness, if you have a video of the event, well, the video acts like the witness. So that's not going to that's actually a witness. But if you're going to corroborate a living eyewitness in some way, it's only going to be a fraction of his or her statement. Because if you told me you jumped over the counter and this guy jumped over the counter and screamed at the teller and pointed a gun at her and demanded money, well, I might be able to find a palm print to corroborate the witness's statement on the counter. But the palm print will not tell me what he was wearing or any of the other aspects of the witness's statement. What did he say? Was he carrying a gun? That palm print's not going to tell me any of that. So remember, I'm looking for corroborative evidence, but I expect it to be only a fraction of the overall statement. 3, did they change their story over time? Or have they been honest and accurate consistently? And 4, do they possess a bias that would cause them to want to lie to me? So these are the things that I'm looking at in eyewitnesses. And I decided, well, could I apply that strategy to the gospel authors? So my strategy and my approach is different than, say, for example, years later, I was reading, Sean McDowell became a friend of mine. We were taking students on mission trips. And I finally got a copy of the second edition of his dad's book back in those days. Not the one that's out right now, but there was a second edition in the middle.
There was more evidence, I think.
Yeah, whatever it was called.
Yeah.
I got that. And I saw, and I worked with Josh and Sean, and I've seen the approach they take. They'll talk about, well, how many manuscripts do we have? What is the distance between the event and the first man? None of that stuff matters to me. Eyewitnesses come down to those 4 things. And if the gospel authors pass the test in those 4 areas, why would we not consider them reliable? Well, it comes down to they pass the test in those 4 areas, but we have hesitancy about their reliability because they include miracles. Look, if I always said this, if the gospels did not include miracles, how many people would find that the story is preposterous and discard Jesus of Nazareth as a historical character? Nobody would. Also, I see a lot right now is that there's a lot of scholarship and torment right now occurring related to contradictions that are seen between the Gospels. And I see people who are now, at least I see a lot in the last 5 years, that people will say, well, the genre of eyewitness accounts in the first century allowed for such a thing. I'm going to tell you right now, there is no reason to jump to some literary theory related to genre, because current eyewitnesses on an event that happens today, if there are 5 eyewitnesses, they will end up having the exact same amount of variation in their accounts. I know this only because I do it, okay? So I don't jump to, maybe the genre of eyewitness statements time included this. No, this is just what, now, can we determine what really happened? And by the way, defense attorneys love this, because they know there will be differences. In every case I've ever had, the defense attorney tries to play on those differences to convince a jury that no one should be trusted. Mm-hmm. And I've never lost a case because people understand. We even have a jury instruction that tells the jury that just because there are differences in their story, they are not to be discredited, because people see things differently and they remember different details and they put things in different orders and doesn't make a point. And I'll tell you that if you were to go back to the first century and you were the first or second reader of these documents, there were still people there that could explain why they sound and look differently. But the problem is as you get 30 years down the road, now all my witnesses are dead on a cold case. I don't have anyone to explain why you gave the statement in that order, or why you omitted this part, or why you said this thing doesn't make any sense. And I'm 30 years down the road. I can't go back to the scene and go, oh, yeah, that's why it happened. So I just don't see any reason to jump to genre or to jump to a literary theory to reconcile differences, because you will see some dramatic differences in eyewitness testimony. And by the way, our goal as detectives is to preserve those differences. So that's the first instruction we have. Dispatch calls me in the middle of the night to go to a homicide. I only have one instruction. Have the officers who are on the scene separate the eyewitnesses, because I want the differences to be maintained.
Interesting.
It'll help me to put the case. I'm the puzzler. Don't you start puzzling me before I get. So that's kind of my view of it, was that the differences actually in the accounts when I first read them were the thing that triggered for me, I should apply this template because this looks and feels texturally like eyewitness accounts. The level of variation is exactly what I would expect. So I just upset about
the kind of the theory that this is people writing at a later time to kind of have a put Mark in a priestly position and kind of have this tie everything back to Levitical priest and tie everything to Jesus. You see that theory as being less likely because you have these variations where you have people who emphasize different details, like for example in John 2, where he talks about leaving Capernaum, like that was John's hometown, and so he just makes this offhanded remark as if we would, if Tony and I were to say, oh, and we passed through Kalamazoo, and no one would know where Kalamazoo is at, but we would, because hey, that's our hometown. Right.
Well, there's some places in the Gospel of John, a pool, for example, that was destroyed in 70 AD, but he writes about it as though everyone knows where that is, because it probably is pre-70 AD. There's lots of ways to kind of dig out details about dating and all kinds of things from the Gospels. That's all well and good. I am just less inclined when I know that the tail that's wagging the dog on a literary theory is an effort to reconcile differences between the accounts. That's when I say, hold on. You don't need to develop a theory to reconcile differences any more than you would need to develop a theory today. Because I guarantee you, if I have a homicide tonight and I get called out, there will be differences that I just know. Now, what the great thing about it in live, I work cold cases. I can't always go back and talk to the witnesses, but on a fresh case, if I'm talking to witnesses and I see there's a problem, I can go back and ask the first witness. And I won't tell them what the second witness said. I'll just say, tell me again about this, trying to see if he'll add that detail that he admitted the first time to reconcile it. Unfortunately, we don't have that ability with the Gospels. We can't go back and re-interview the sources and ask kind of to mine out why there might be some variations between the accounts. Now, the problem I think it comes up, though, is that for Christians, we're like, hey, well, this is the inerrant word. How do we reconcile inerrancy? Would God allow the eyewitnesses to have the level of variation we would expect to have between eyewitnesses? I think he would, if he wanted us to be able to test them later. So I always look at it and say, if God was determined to present us with 4 accounts that have all the earmarks of reliable eyewitness testimony, he achieved it. Because we have 4 accounts that, it's my experience talking to eyewitnesses, are as varied and different as eyewitness accounts are in real cases in real time. So I had great confidence that that's the goal God has in his inerrant word. He has achieved it. Yeah. So you have to define what we mean by inerrancy, I think, to begin with.
Always defining in terms is important. And I think too, it's one of those things where atheists kind of, or at least critics who are being uncharitable or who are kind of parroting what they've heard. Even Bart Ehrman comes about with this theory of like, I need 3 signatured copies of the Gospel of Mark, and then I would take it as confidence that Mark wrote it. But at the same time, if let's say that all 4 gospel writers wrote exactly the same thing, well, you would just make that decision that, well, whoever the author was just wrote his name different 4 different times. And so what they're suggesting is, everything has to be said exactly the same. But you would say, well, there's collusion here, there's a conspiracy, or there's just a single author who just wrote different names on a sheet of paper.
Yeah, I actually think that regardless of how this would have turned out, and I know this is the case, right? I mean, we do cases, and regardless of how we put them together, there'll be a defense attorney who will develop a theory about how to defeat our case. This is just what happens. You don't get to a case and you now I've got this one. I've learned from my other cases better. So now I know when I go to trial, that defense attorney is just going to say, hey, you know what? We have nothing to say. No, the defense attorney is going to spend months developing a robust theory to defeat ours. That's what defense attorneys do. God bless them. I think that there's a need to be properly. I'm not an anti-defense attorney guy. I talk about this in the book, that there are three different kinds of defense attorneys: people who truly believe their client is innocent, people who truly believe that even if their client isn't innocent, that the system works best and requires all of us to do our best in defending people. That's probably the lion's share, by the way, of defense attorneys. And then the third is people who just love money, and they'll take any client and do anything if the money is big enough. That's a very small percentage in my view. The biggest percentage are people who think that even though my client is guilty, I have a robust duty to defend him to the best of my ability. And so that means that when I walk in, I don't care how strong my case is on the prosecution side, there will be if you've got the right attorney who's got a skill set. And by the way, if my case was slightly different, he would adjust. If my case was entirely different, he would adjust to that. And so I think that this is true also of any kind of skeptic who is pushing back against a claim, that regardless of what our claims would have been, regardless of whatever you imagine, if I had documents that were like X, there'd be no complaining. Oh no, there would be. There would be a robust defense offered against that version of the Gospels. So I'm kind of like, okay, well, that's just the way this works. I think in the end that there is a robust laboratory of epistemology. How do you know what we know? How do you defend what we know? How do you communicate what is true? That occurs every day in courtrooms across America. And this doesn't happen. I mean, you might write a paper and have your other equals, literary critics, maybe peer review the paper. But what happens in criminal trials is you have a theory about a claim, and you present the theory about the claim, and you get to test, number one, how do I know a theory is true? How do I know the claim is true? Two, how do I even communicate it well to a jury? What works, what doesn't work in communicating the claim? This is a laboratory for discovering truth and communicating truth to others that very few other disciplines get to experience repeatedly. That's why I've always felt like, this is why so many books about Christianity, defending the Christian worldview, have been written with titles like that involve some form of evidence, courtroom, or trial, right? Yet they're not written by anybody who spent any time in a criminal trial. So it turns out they're right, that this is the best analogy. This is the best place, I think, to learn how to discover truth and communicate it to others. But unless you've been doing that for your career, you're kind of on the outside wondering what it looks like inside that room. Yeah. So all I wanted to do in Cold Case was to show you what it looks like inside the room.